There are films that entertain. There are films that provoke. And then there are films that governments try to erase. In 1988, a low-budget German film was seized, banned across multiple countries, and quietly pushed out of public view. But here is the question that still lingers decades later. What exactly made it so dangerous? This is the story of Nekromantik, and the truth behind it is far stranger than the controversy. When I first came across this film, I expected something simple. A shock film, a provocation, a filmmaker chasing attention through outrage. But the deeper I went, the more that assumption began to fall apart. Because behind the bans, behind the seizures, behind the international backlash, there was a young director from West Berlin who believed he was making something else entirely. Not a scandal, not an exploitation piece, but a love story. In this documentary, we are going to trace how a no-budget underground film became one of the most banned and most debated works in modern cinema history. And why, decades later, some scholars argue the world misunderstood it completely. To understand what Jörg Buttgereit was doing, you have to understand where he was doing it. West Berlin in the late 1970s and early 1980s was not just a city. It was a psychological condition, surrounded by the Berlin Wall, cut off from the east, suspended in a strange political tension. It existed as an island of Western culture under constant pressure. And pressure, historically, does something very specific to art. It pushes it outward, into the experimental, into the uncomfortable, into the forbidden. This was a city that attracted artists who did not want boundaries. Filmmakers, musicians, painters, people drawn not to stability but to edges. And Jörg Buttgereit grew up right in the middle of it. Like many young cinephiles, he absorbed everything he could find: horror films, science fiction, American B-movies, Japanese monster cinema. But his real education happened elsewhere, in the margins, in the underground. The VHS revolution had created something new, a hidden network of film culture. Collectors, traders, obsessives, passing tapes from hand to hand. And the most valuable films were never the mainstream ones. They were the ones you weren't supposed to see. Now, before we go further, consider this. If you were a young filmmaker in a divided city, with no money, no backing, and no rules, what kind of film would you make? Because that question is exactly where this story begins to change. Buttgereit had been experimenting with film since his teenage years. Super 8. Short projects. Fragments of ideas built around one central obsession: mortality. But eventually, experimentation wasn't enough. He wanted to make something bigger. A feature. The problem was simple. He had almost no money. So he did what independent filmmakers have always done. He adapted. Working with a small group of collaborators, he began shooting on weekends. Borrowed time, borrowed equipment, minimal resources. The entire budget was roughly 40,000 Deutsche Marks. By any standard, that was nothing. But limitation, handled correctly, becomes something else entirely. It becomes atmosphere. The film's grainy Super 8 aesthetic, unstable, imperfect, raw, didn't weaken the story. It defined it. On the surface, the narrative follows a young man named Rob and his girlfriend Betty. Two people connected by something unconventional. And together, they bring something into their lives that should never have been brought home. Now, without reducing this into something it was never meant to be, what Buttgereit constructed was, structurally, a romantic tragedy, a story about desire, possession, loss, and the human inability to let go. That was his intention. But when the film reached an audience, everything changed. This is where the story shifts. Because up to this point, it might seem predictable, a controversial film, a strong reaction, end of story. But that is not what happened. Not even close. The film premiered quietly in West Berlin in 1988. Little attention, minimal reaction. For a moment, it seemed like it might disappear unnoticed. Then something unexpected happened. A copy made its way to London, to a place called the Scala Cinema. and to an event known as Shock Around the Clock. Now, the Scala was not an ordinary cinema. It was a cultural hub for transgressive film, an audience that believed it had already seen everything. They were wrong. What happened during that screening spread quickly through word of mouth, through underground networks, through the same VHS culture that had built this world in the first place. And the more people talked about the film, the more certain groups decided it should never be seen, which, of course, had the opposite effect. Because censorship does not erase curiosity, it amplifies it. And this is where things escalate. Nekromantik was banned in multiple countries: Norway, Iceland, Malaysia, Singapore. Australia followed in 1992, Finland in 1993, New Zealand in 1999. In parts of Canada, it was explicitly prohibited, and in the United Kingdom, a country already shaped by the video nasties panic, it would take 26 years before the film was officially released uncut. Think about that, 26 years. But here's what makes this more interesting. The film didn't spread through normal distribution. It moved through underground channels, tape trading, bootleg copies, degraded VHS recordings passed from one person to another. And with each generation, the image became more distorted, more ghost-like, less like a film, and more like something recovered. Meanwhile, in Germany, authorities pursued legal action against its sequel. Charges were considered, pressure increased, and for a time, the filmmaker himself faced real consequences. All of this for a film he believed was about something deeply human. And this is where the narrative becomes more complicated. Because years later, something unexpected began to happen. Scholars started revisiting the film, not dismissing it, studying it, analyzing it seriously. And many of them reached a conclusion that challenged everything people thought they knew. That Nekromantik was not simply exploitation, but something far more layered, a work engaging with themes deeply rooted in German cultural history: death, memory, collective trauma, questions shaped by a country still processing its past. Film festivals began screening it. Critics began reframing it. And the language used to describe it shifted. This was no longer just controversy. This was analysis. And once that shift happens, the entire story changes. For a certain generation, Nekromantik became more than a film. It became a legend. You didn't find it easily. You heard about it from someone who knew someone. A tape, a copy, a version passed along quietly. And when you finally saw it, it felt different. Not just because of what it contained, but because of what it represented: a boundary, something just beyond what mainstream cinema allowed. That experience, the search, the discovery, the shared secrecy, has almost disappeared today. But at the time, it defined an entire culture, and Nekromantik sat at the center of it. Decades later, the film found a different kind of recognition. Restorations, special editions, academic discussion. The same film once banned and seized was now being preserved, re-examined, contextualized, and the conversations around it changed. Not entirely, but enough to shift its place in history. Because films that disappear are forgotten, but films that remain controversial endure. What I keep returning to is this. Jörg Buttgereit was in his early 20s, working with almost nothing, in a divided city, trying to say something about love and loss and the fear of letting go. The methods he chose were extreme, but the question underneath them was not. And maybe that is why the film still exists in conversation. Because it forces a confrontation, not just with the film itself, but with the limits of what we are willing to accept as art. If you're interested in the real stories behind banned, forgotten, and misunderstood films, subscribe, because the next story might be even more surprising.